The ringing of this bell signals that a small but historic event is about to take place. The riverboat is about to depart on its daily excursion cruise up the river a ways and back again with the cargo of sightseeing tourists. In many respects, this is a common sight along the inland rivers of America. From Pittsburgh to Peoria, St. Louis to Cincinnati to New Orleans, paddle-wheeled riverboats recall the days of Mark Twain and the era when steamboats ruled the rivers. But in many other respects, this particular boat is unique. Most paddle-wheelers today are diesel-powered replicas of the old steamboats. Not only are most of them not true steamboats, as often as not, even their paddle wheels are just for looks. At best, such boats can only give a vague impression of life on the rivers a century ago. For anyone seeking to experience more, to actually know firsthand the sights and sounds and smells of an old Mississippi River-style steamboat, then in all the thousands of miles of America's inland waterways, there is only one place to go: Louisville, Kentucky. For this boat is not a replica, not a copy, not a reconstruction, but the genuine original article. Built in the early years of the 20th century, with technology firmly rooted in the 19th, Mark Twain himself would feel at home in her pilot house or her engine room. For well over 80 years, she has gracefully, leisurely, if not quietly, gone about her business along the rivers of America. Her history is rich and colorful, and with as many twists and bends and unexpected turns as the rivers she's traveled. In many ways, she ought to be one of the most famous vessels in the world. For certainly no other steamboat in American history has lasted as long, been to as many places, or traveled as many miles as this one. She is called the Belle of Louisville, and this is her story.
That big stern wheeler coming up the creek make my eyes start to water and my knees get weak. That old big whistle when it starts to blow says, come on, it's time to go. Well, I want to be planted when I die, where I can see steamboats a-paddling by, 'cause all I ever wanted since 10 years old was to pick and ride an old boat. Now see that pilot at the wheel, shaving shoals on a 12-inch keel. I hope someday that he'll be me on the MISIP.
Springtime in Louisville, and the Belle is preparing to leave her winter berth near the McAlpin Locks and Dam. She has spent the long winter being scrubbed and cleaned, inspected and repaired as necessary, and in general getting spruced up for the busy summer season ahead. With only minor variations, it is a routine that has been going on in Louisville for more than 30 years. Over the next 7 months, well over 200,000 passengers will walk her decks, watch her paddle wheel churning the river, and hear her whistle and calliope fill the air. And perhaps not 1 in 100 will have a true appreciation of just how rare and special this boat really is. From the 1820s through the 1930s, thousands like her were built. At any given time, hundreds like her could be seen coming and going along the rivers of America's heartland. Today, she is the only one left. To step aboard her is to step backwards in time. Historian Jack Custer.
Now, the Belle of Louisville is one of the more interesting steamboats of all time. She was built in 1914 and 1915, and she represents the oldest American steamboat running right now, as well as probably the most classic style of steamboat in existence. She represents a very interesting part of American history because she's seen so many years, say from 1914 through 1996, and she's still doing the same thing. She's still blowing the same whistle she started with, and there is quite a bit of the original boat there.
The steamboat that would one day become the Belle of Louisville was built for an America of a different time. The year was 1913. America was a bustling, growing nation, moving ever forward while trying not to lose too much sight of where it had been. In early July, more than 50,000 grizzled veterans met in a small town in Pennsylvania. With backs stooped with age, heads held high with pride, many wearing their tattered blue or gray uniforms, they met to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg. Several hundred miles away in Memphis, Tennessee, people gathered on the wharf at the riverfront. 50 years earlier, the citizens of Memphis had gathered on the bluffs above town and watched as a federal gunboat squadron had swept away a makeshift Confederate flotilla and captured the city for the Union. These days, people gathered to catch the ferry boats to Arkansas. For then, as now, America was a nation on the move. And while the sputtering, cantankerous, gasoline-powered automobile was becoming an increasingly common sight, in 1913 the power that moved America and the world was steam. From factories to locomotives to ocean liners and, of course, riverboats, steam powered everything. Memphis was thriving in 1913, and several ferryboat companies competed for the brisk trade with towns along the Arkansas shore. The only completed bridge across the river carried the railroad, and while the new Harahan Bridge would eventually open for traffic, for several years to come the regular ferryboats were the only convenient way to get from one shore to the other. The largest ferry operator was the West Memphis Packet Company, and in the summer of 1913, the company was looking for a new ferryboat.
And Memphis had a number of ferries that were designed to carry people from one side of the river to the other, especially up to Mound City, Arkansas, and other areas throughout that general vicinity. And there's one called the Charles Oregon. The Oregon had lived pretty much her full life, and there was need to build a new boat.
To find a builder for their new boat, the company looked to Pittsburgh and the firm of James Reese and Sons. The child of Welsh immigrants who had come to America in the 1820s, Captain James Reese had risen from poverty to become one of the most prominent men in Pittsburgh, and the boat-building firm he had started in 1845 was known throughout the world. Reese and Sons had been pioneers in the use of innovative all-steel construction for their boats. Although the idea of steel or iron riverboats was not new, Reese and Sons boats had earned a reputation for quality, dependability, and most of all, durability. From their Pittsburgh headquarters, they sold steamboats all over the world, with Russia and a number of South American countries among their largest customers. Boats destined for overseas would be fabricated in Pittsburgh, then shipped unassembled to their destinations. The company had made an international fortune. Since Henry Shreve built the steamer Washington in 1816, almost all steamboats built for America's inland river system had followed a similar design. It had come to be known as the Mississippi River style, and the boat that Reese and Sons planned for the West Memphis Packet Company followed this classic pattern. It was a good but conservative design, with the emphasis being on functional rather than elegant. In late August of 1913, the go-ahead was given to begin construction on the as yet unnamed new steamboat. A delivery date for the following June was announced, a date which proved to be overly optimistic. In an ironic coincidence, less than 2 weeks after the new boat was announced, wealthy German industrialist and engineer Rudolf Diesel fell off a steamboat in the English Channel and drowned. Within 20 years, his diesel engines would herald the doom of steamboating throughout the world. On the banks of the Allegheny River in Pittsburgh, throughout the fall and winter of 1913 to 1914, the new boat began to take shape. Economic factors dictated that the boat had to be both versatile and unusually rugged.
And when it came time to build a modern steamboat, they had to look at labor cost, fuel cost, and things of this sort. Because from, say, 1902 through 1910, the cost for steamboating had gone up considerably. They actually outdid themselves. She was a very strong boat, a very economical boat, and just surprisingly well designed.
Knowing that transporting cars and trucks would be a regular part of her job, her main deck included an unusual innovation. Captain Kevin Mullen.
So she was built to be a ferry boat, carry package, freight, cars and trucks. And she had a half-inch asphalt on her main deck, which was a new invention. And part of her survival today is because of that ferry service. Her hull framing was built extra tough to be able to carry a lot of weight. She was beefed up a lot more than most boats.
Although most of the boat's machinery was new, her engines actually came from another boat and were much older.
Now, those engines were in storage at the James Reese Yard in Pittsburgh on the Allegheny River. And they had been around for years and years. They had been used on some previous boat, and probably they were cast in the 1880s and used up till a certain time. They needed those engines, so they were pulled out. They're a good set of engine, a very reliable engine, very heavy duty, and they have been running on that boat from 1915 on.
June 1914. In the Bosnian capital of Sarajevo, ethnic tensions came to a head when a young Serbian nationalist shot and killed Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary. The assassination triggered a cascade of events that plunged the world into war. June 1914 was also the month that the West Memphis Packet Company's new steamboat was supposed to have been ready. But construction had progressed much slower than planned, and the new boat was nowhere near finished. Finally, in mid-October, the boat was launched, although much work still needed to be done. And by late November, she at last had a name, the Idlewild.
There were some previous boats that had that name, and they had liked the name because the name where you would idle a while. It was just sort of a resting place. And they had had a summer camp up in some hills around Memphis and somewhere in Tennessee that was called Idlewild.
At the time of her launching, the Idlewild represented nearly a century of experience in steamboat technology. She was fast, as far as steamboats went, and powerful for her size. Her 21 watertight compartments made her practically unsinkable, and her steel hull and superstructure made her extremely durable. Her steam-assisted power steering made her relatively easy to handle, and her size made her economical to operate. As time would prove, it was a very fortunate combination of factors.
She was built the right size. She wasn't too big, she wasn't too small. She was not very expensive to operate, but was big enough that you could make money with her. She was built to run in a multitude of services. She could carry passengers, she could carry freight.
At long last, in early January of 1915, the Idlewild left Pittsburgh for Memphis, under the command of Captain Thomas Reese, son of company founder James Reese. Total cost of construction had been somewhere between $80,000 and $85,000. And as the Idlewild steamed downriver on that cold January morning, no one could have predicted that she was embarking on the longest career of any steamboat in American history. A few days later, she reached Louisville, Kentucky, and the only obstacle to navigation on the entire river, the Falls of the Ohio. The river was up, and rather than wait for the locks, Captain Reese took the Idlewild straight over the falls. It was a risky venture, but one that showed just how rugged the boat was. The Idlewild had not stopped at Louisville, but no matter. The old river town and the young river boat would be meeting again. On January 17, 1915, the Idlewild arrived at Memphis. Captain Reese turned her over to Captain John C. Wyckoff of the West Memphis Packet Company, and by April she was running regular ferry and excursion trips for the company.
She ran there for some years in this basic routine of going across the river, going up to Mound City. And a lot of times on the weekends, they would use her as an excursion boat as well. So she was designed to haul cotton in small amounts, cotton seed, freight, and then passengers. And she ran some rather interesting years, say from 1915 through 1920.
She ran to Mound City a lot. She ran as a ferry boat to carry people who were going over to Arkansas. Not just a ferry boat, but they also combined her to be a passenger boat. She came out with a dance floor, a wooden dance floor.
As the years went by, the owners modified the boat somewhat. To give the passengers extra protection from the sweltering Tennessee sun, the roof was extended and a retractable awning added. Although never intended to carry overnight passengers, the crew and special guests often did stay on board overnight, so extra cabins were added to the top or Texas deck. As new bridges opened, the ferry business declined, and the Idlewild began to journey farther afield.
And after a while, the bridges were completed, and there was no longer the need for the ferry boat to take people across the river. You could drive across the bridge after a while. And then later on, the famous Memphis trades gave out because of the change in economics. So this kind of put her out to pasture in some ways, but yet she was a very compact, economical steamboat. And then she kind of began a life of her own, where she was going around as an excursion packet, and what they called a tramp steamer back then, where there was no set routine. She would move from town to town. And she was able to begin into this tramp routine where she would go from town to town on this rather strange itinerary each year, pick up passengers, run out of a town for a while, then go on to the next town. So she would go from one end of the river to the other.
Finally, after 12 years in Memphis, the West Memphis Packet Company decided that the Idlewild was no longer needed.
She ran up until 1927, where she was sold down the river to New Orleans to a fellow named Cesar Mestre.
Her stay in New Orleans proved to be brief.
She only spent a year there. There were 4 boats running excursions in New Orleans that summer, so everybody starved. Mr. Mestre sold the boat to the New St. Louis and Calhoun Packet Company in 1927. And there were 4 people involved in that: John Meyer, Henry Meyer, Alvina Blumenberg, and James Phillips. They were all members of a family, and James Phillips was the captain. Calhoun County in Illinois was a big apple growing area. They owned an apple basket production company, and so they would use the boat in the fall to transport these apple baskets to market, and also the apples.
For the next 20 years, the Idlewild's home port would be St. Louis, Missouri, and here she would return each year for the fall harvest. But in the spring and summer, she would run regular excursion trips out of different cities along the inland rivers, beginning in 1928 at Kansas City. Between regular engagements, she continued her ever-widening tramping journeys up and down the rivers of America's heartland, taking on whatever cargoes she could find and booking excursion trips in river town after river town. As was not uncommon aboard riverboats of the era, not all of her cargoes were strictly legitimate.
I would like to say as the Belle Louisville that we would never do anything unsavory. This is a family operation here. We are in a family, catering to family business. But in the boat's history, I've heard stories from some crew on here that couldn't get another bottle of liquor or a bottle of beer into the holds of this boat. In her tramping business, she would run into a lot of dry areas. And of course, the sheriff would come down and he would always say, you know, we don't want you selling any beer or any whiskey in our area. And they'd say, oh, sure. And then the sheriff would walk off with a bottle of whiskey under one hand and a case of beer under the other. And then, of course, they'd go off and sell the liquor. And then, you know, I'm sure that, like I say, with liquor and beer, that they may not have had all the correct licenses or paid all the taxes that you're supposed to pay when you're engaging in that stuff.
By the time of the Great Depression, her owners were looking for even more ways to make money with the boat, and her rugged construction and extra power proved valuable. By 1931, she had been fitted out with towing knees and was occasionally working as a towboat. As if a foreshadowing of things to come, For several years in the early 1930s, she operated out of Louisville, Kentucky.
From 1931 through 34, the Idlewild was Louisville's excursion boat. She ran here from the foot of 4th Street or from Fountain Ferry up above 12 Mile and 14 Mile Creek area where they had Rose Island.
There were several spots that people would take steamboats to. Some people would come down to Fountain Ferry, and then there were certain eras when the Idlewild would go up to Rose Island as well.
And she did this almost every summer. She ran here April through September and then would winter around Alton, Illinois or Calhoun County or around St. Louis.
She continued working on through the Great Depression and managed to be safely out of danger during the disastrous 1937 flood. Just a few months after the flood, she was back on the Ohio River again, going about business as usual. The Depression had put many steamboats out of business, but the Idlewild just kept steaming along, with only an occasional mishap, such as running aground once in a while, and once in a while running afoul of local authorities. Captain Mike Fitzgerald.
So in part of her colorful career, she was actually a gambling boat for a while. Whether it was legal or not, she did it. One interesting article in the 1941 Louisville Courier-Journal on one of the Idlewild's jaunts away from home when she returned. The article read, "Jefferson County Sheriff's deputies raided the steamer Idlewild last night, and while the band played Cut Out the Lights and Called the Law, 7 coin-operated machines, later described as gambling devices, were removed and destroyed."
Through the early years of World War II, the Idlewild continued her tramping and excursion trade. In 3 months alone in 1942, she traveled over 6 rivers, going all the way from St. Joseph, Missouri to Knoxville, Tennessee. Throughout the rest of the war, she did occasional towing and even served briefly as a USO boat, entertaining soldiers on the home front. But the years following the war saw a great change coming over the rivers. To the America of the post-war years, riding an old steamboat held less and less appeal. Where once almost every major river city had at least one excursion steamboat, by the late 1940s there were very few left. Although commercial river transportation grew, more and more the work was being done by diesel-powered boats. Powerful, efficient, and utterly without charm. But in every measurable sense, diesel boats were superior to steamboats. Diesel boats were cheaper, easier to maintain, and far more powerful. But some values can't be measured in horsepower, fuel economy, and maintenance costs alone. And as the old steamers slowly vanished, so went a way of life and an era of history. 1947 was a year of strange coincidences in the history of the Idlewild. By 1947, Captain James Phillips was ready to retire.
He was retiring from the river, and he and his wife, who had worked on the boat, were going back to St. Louis. And he said that the boat would outlast him, and how prophetic those words were.
With the retirement of the longtime captain, the company decided to sell the boat. The Idlewild's next home was Peoria, Illinois.
The boat was sold to a fellow in Peoria, Illinois for $15,000. This fellow, Harold Gorsuch, ran it out of Peoria, and he ran it up on the Illinois River and the upper Mississippi River.
Like her time in New Orleans, the Idlewild's stay in Peoria was brief, but much more colorful.
Peoria, it was kind of a wide open town at that time, and it was a meeting place between some of the gangs in Chicago and St. Louis, and it was considered neutral territory. And Peoria was supposedly had casinos, the party ground and the meeting place between these two rival areas. Supposedly the boat was a part of that. You know, again, this is all just a legend. We don't have any facts on it, but it sure makes the boat interesting.
Ironically, the Idlewild was not the only old steamboat that changed hands that year. The last great passenger steamboat line in the inland river system was the Green Lines of Cincinnati. Unlike the Idlewild, Green Line steamers offered elegant overnight passenger accommodations. And in 1947, Captain Tom Green was in California shopping for a steamboat. The boat he bought at a government auction would one day have a profound connection with the future Belle of Louisville, a steamboat called the Delta Queen. Cincinnati was also the home of one of the last great excursion steamboats still running, the magnificent sidewheeler Island Queen. Owned by Cincinnati's Coney Island Amusement Park, in the fall of 1947, the Island Queen was in Pittsburgh. A tragic accident with a welding torch killed 19 people, shattered windows for several blocks, and reduced the Island Queen to a pile of twisted rubble. After the tragedy, the owners of Coney Island decided that it was not feasible to buy or build a replacement for the Island Queen. The time for such boats had passed. But the park's promotion manager, Ernest Meyer, believed that there was still room on the rivers for an excursion boat, if the right boat could be found. Meanwhile, back in Peoria,
it was at this time in 1948 that her name was changed. And the story is, this was the deathbed request of a Captain Ben Winters, who had worked on an Avalon, had started his river career, an earlier version, completely different boat down on the in Tennessee. And the reason he had a heart attack in the story is that the boat was being raided by federal agents for illegal gambling machines and liquor. And while the boat was being raided at 2 o'clock in the morning, they were kicking his door in, the captain had a heart attack. So they changed the name to Avalon.
not long after the death of Captain Winters, the newly named Avalon was for sale, and Ernest Meyer was ready. So the Avalon came to Cincinnati. Meyer left Coney Island, hired many of the surviving crew members of the Island Queen, and the Avalon embarked on the next stage of her long career. In 1948, the Avalon was already a floating anachronism, a leftover from another time, trying to survive in an era when America seemed to be forgetting, or at least neglecting, much of its heritage. Yet it was in this era that the Avalon set out to become the last great tramping excursion steamboat in the inland waterways. The owners realized that to survive at all, the boat would have to range farther and wider and move quicker than had ever been done before. To do that, changes would have to be made. So, as time and funds became available, over the next several years the Avalon was gradually modified, slowly taking on much of the appearance the boat retains to this day. By the mid-1950s, her elongated Texas cabin had been shortened again, and cruise quarters installed on the main deck. With a full-time crew of about 50, accommodations were less than luxurious. For added stability, her hull was widened by 5 feet, and in the winter of 1953, she was converted from burning coal to diesel fuel. The most visible change was the gradual enclosing of the entire main and boiler decks, which was done to extend her operating season and range into colder months and locations. Although very practical, it did little to enhance her appearance. But enclosing the boiler deck also meant that the dance floor could be widened, and a new polished maple floor was installed. To reach towns farther up rivers, she would have to clear lower bridges than she was designed for, so her stacks were shortened, the roof of the pilot house flattened, and even her whistle pipe cut and hinged to lay flat. All of these changes allowed the Avalon to survive and continue operating long after most other steamboats on the rivers were gone. Over a period of 14 years, the Avalon became the most traveled steamboat in American history, covering 8 rivers in 17 states and stopping at literally hundreds of cities and small towns along the way. In brief, Steamer Avalon went everywhere. Throughout the 1950s, she kept alive a tradition that had all but faded away, and many baby boomer-age steamboat enthusiasts today can trace their interest in steamboating to childhood memories of the Avalon coming to town. Many river professionals today began their careers on the Avalon.
She's almost been a floating university for people to gain their steamboat licenses. Probably more people have become mates, pilots, and masters from that steamboat than any other source known to mankind.
It has been said that much of history is made up of small events, seemingly insignificant at the time, yet having a profound effect on later generations. In the history of the Belle of Louisville, one such event occurred in 1951, and in a very real sense, one of the key reasons the steamboat is running to this day can be traced back to the day the calliope player quit. The shrill sounds of the calliope usually heralded the boat's approach to a town. But on that day in 1951, the calliope was silent when the Avalon docked at Charleston, West Virginia. Among the waiting passengers was a teenager named Clark Holly. Captain Clark Doc Holly.
And I asked why the calliope wasn't playing. And they told me the calliope player had quit in Huntington, West Virginia, the previous town. And I said, I'd like to try it. And the captain says, what makes you think you could play the calliope? And I says, because I have a pump organ at home and I can play by ear. Well, he knew there was a spark of a chance, you see. So I went up and played it, and he said, young man, what are you doing for the summer? And I said, I'm working as a copy boy for the Charleston Daily Mail newspaper. And he said, would you like to work on this boat as a calliope player? And I said, well, how much does it pay? And he said, $27.50 a week and room and board. And I said, well, I'm making $35 a week at the Daily Mail as a copy boy. And he said, well, I'll tell you what, if you pop popcorn, in addition to playing the calliope, I'll pay you $35 and room and board. So I thought that was a fair deal, and I got on the Avalon then, and I've been boating ever since.
The true significance of that event would not become apparent for 10 years. The Avalon continued on through the 1950s, going every place she could go, and sometimes even trying to go places she shouldn't.
Knocked the smokestacks down at Knoxville one time, coming out of Knoxville.
Tramp steamers had always had a rough and tumble reputation, and the Avalon certainly lived up to it.
In the 1950s, you had people looking at steamboats as being one step above a carnival life, and in many places you found people who would just claim the Avalon was bringing a bunch of ruffians to town.
We had our share of fights. You see, every small town especially had a local bad boy. Local bad boy, a drugstore cowboy type who would want to make a name for himself and usually start a fight. And we had a little brig on there, and I've had as many as 5 people in the brig.
In an article in the Egregious Steamboat Journal, an author captured the spirit of the Avalon's later years.
But there was always something else in those dog days of summer, a boat. Not just any boat, but a stern-wheel excursion steamboat, the Avalon. When the great day finally came, the lumbering stern-wheeler would announce her arrival with shrill blasts of a steam whistle that could do things to the human eardrum that nature had not intended. She was not exactly a pretty boat, but she was one that granted credence to the fact that she was the oldest of her type on the Mississippi. She was rough and somewhat crude, not unlike the strong-shouldered men in sweaty T-shirts who manned her decks. There existed a vague, unwritten law of the river that almost anyone could get a drink as long as he had money to put on the bar. Suffice it to say, the merrymaking did occasionally get out of hand.
By the late 1950s, the Avalon was already recognized as something rare and unique. But it was getting harder and harder to make ends meet on the boat.
The main thing was the business had played out. People weren't interested in coming down to the river for a steamboat ride anymore. And they stayed home, watched Milton Berle on the television, cooled off in their own living room. No longer did they have to sit out on the front porch in a swing and listen to the radio.
While the Avalon made enough money to keep going, there was less and less left over for needed repairs and maintenance. Avalon became something of a floating museum, as more and more the crew cannibalized parts from other old steamboats that were no longer running. Naval architect Alan Bates.
And my heart goes out to the crew because they literally kept the boat running all that time by scrounging mainly. And fortunately, at that time, there were a number of ancient steamboats in various stages of collapse, and they went to them and got pieces and parts to keep her going.
If the Avalon was to survive much longer, what it needed was a financial miracle. What it got instead was a near disaster. On May 24, 1958, the Avalon was approaching the Emsworth Lock near Pittsburgh.
Going into Emsworth Lock, she failed to back. A mix-up of engine room signals or a defect in the machinery, but she didn't back. She went on in and slammed the lock gate.
In the collision, 1,100 passengers were thrown to the decks, and both the boat and the lock were damaged. Although no one was seriously injured, 22 people were temporarily hospitalized. At a time when the boat was already deferring needed maintenance, the Avalon was slapped with more than 30 damage claims totaling over $128,000. While the owners vowed to carry on, how much longer it would be possible was anyone's guess. Miraculously, the Avalon struggled on for 3 more seasons, although by 1961 she barely passed Coast Guard inspections. The boat's master that year was Captain Ernest Wagner, a gruff but gentle giant of a man, and a survivor of the Island Queen explosion. His first mate was the young Captain Clark Hawley. Although the future of the boat was very much in doubt, the 1961 season was not all doom and gloom.
Probably the most colorful excursion we ever ran was a trip that was looked down upon by the Coast Guard, but they didn't know anything about it until the trip was almost over. We took 700 Girl Scouts from Memphis to New Orleans on a boat that didn't have any staterooms. They stayed on the boat camporee style, on the dance floor, on the Texas deck, everywhere. And they had sleeping bags. She wasn't classified as an overnight passenger boat. But we took them anyway, and on the way back up, the Coast Guard found out that the Memphis office had okayed it, and they tried to stop the thing, but the Girl Scouts of America were too powerful of a political clout, and they said, no, we're finishing the trip, whether you like it or not. We're not disappointing these girls. So we brought 600 and some Girl Scouts back up from New Orleans after taking 700 down there.
For many of the girls, this was their first experience on a steamboat, and many developed a crush on the dashing young Captain Hawley.
With several hundred teenage girls literally camping out on the decks, it's perhaps best not to speculate too much on the nature of the pilot house conversations during that long trip. So happy were the Girl Scouts with the outcome of the trip that the towering Captain Wagner and the young Captain Hawley were made honorary Girl Scouts. The Avalon finished out the season and headed home for Cincinnati.
Later on, the Avalon didn't stop at our town anymore. I can't remember the exact year she churned down the river for the last time. But the hot August afternoons of young laughter, girls in their summer dresses, disappeared with the same voyage. Only the river remains, and my memory of the journey, and the spirit in which it was taken.
In need of an almost total overhaul, that fall the Coast Guard condemned her hull. The boat was tied up at the wharf, and the owners told the crew to go home. Steamer Avalon was filing for bankruptcy, and in all likelihood the boat herself would be sold for scrap. The Avalon days were over. The bankruptcy court accepted an offer from a local scrapyard. The value placed on half a century of American history was $8,000. If ever the battered old boat truly needed a friend, the time was now. She had, in fact, several. For then occurred a chain of events so unlikely as to seem almost fiction. First, the day the crew was dismissed, the Avalon herself was essentially abandoned by the owners, and they would not pay to prepare the boat for the coming winter. With water still in her engines, boilers, and pipes, there is no doubt that over the long Ohio winter ahead, much of her machinery would have frozen and cracked beyond repair. She would never have run again. But on the day the crew was dismissed, one crew member simply could not turn his back on the boat he had started his career on. A decade earlier, Doc Hawley had bargained for a job on the Avalon. Now, out of his own pocket, he hired another crew member to help, and for 2 days they worked opening valves, draining hoses and pipes, and in general doing all the things one does to prepare a steamboat for the winter.
I was very fond of the boat. I didn't want to see that great old boat freeze up.
Having done all he could to give her at least a chance at a future, but knowing she might end up as scrap all the same, Hawley was not above a little grand larceny to ensure that something of the Avalon would survive no matter what.
I took the big brass plates off the main engines, which I knew would go quickly, brass and copper being worth what it was, and somebody would steal those for junk and have them melted down. The next spring, when I went to work on the Delta Queen, took them to New Orleans.
So it was that pieces of the future Belle of Louisville once got to ride on the Delta Queen. The Avalon's next friend appeared in the form of Cincinnati auctioneer Harold Ephron. Ephron heard of the impending sale to the scrapyard. Believing both that the boat deserved a better fate, and seeing a marvelous promotional opportunity for his company, Ephron approached the bankruptcy court and offered to sell the boat at public auction. It took several determined attempts, but finally the court agreed to let him auction the boat. Ephron's wife was vice president of his company, and a friend of hers owned an ad agency. Together they launched a campaign to promote the coming auction. Cities across the country were informed of the sale, and one of those cities was Louisville, Kentucky. With the new Interstate 64 slated to go right by the riverfront, a number of concerned citizens were interested in drawing attention to, and perhaps saving, Louisville's historic cobblestone wharf. When Louisville Mayor Cowger decided that the city was not interested in the old steamboat, former Mayor Charles Farnsley contacted Jefferson County Judge Executive Marlowe Cook.
I felt that if we could find a way to draw attention to the riverfront, I wanted to do it. The boat was for sale, and we decided that that might be a good attraction, and it might be something that we could use as a leverage to say, save the riverfront.
In a series of hasty phone conversations, Judge Cook got verbal approval to spend up to $40,000 for the boat. And off to Cincinnati they went. May 24th, 1962. Exactly 4 years to the day after the Emsworth lock incident. More than 100 bidders filled the dance floor of the old Avalon. On stage was a friend of Harold Ephron's, a young auctioneer who had just started his own company, Garth Semple. The auction attracted a wide variety of potential buyers, with an equally wide variety of intentions for the old boat. Several cities looked at her as a potential museum or restaurant. One bidder even envisioned turning her into a discount department store. Thanks to Doc Hawley, the boat could be made to run again. But of all the bidders, only Marlowe Cook seemed seriously interested in actually running the boat.
We never even debated whether we were going to use it to run or not. That was never a question. We were going to make it run.
30, get your man in, Joe. I'm going to knock him down. 29 to the 30. Hold up. All right.
Prospects are excellent.
33, but you 33 and a half, another half, another 33, but you 33 and a half, 33 and a half. Are you all done, sir? 33 and a half. Thank you. 34 and 34 and 35. 34 but a bit 5, 5 but a bit 5, and I'm going to 4, and I'm on 5, 5, 5, 5, 5, 5 but a bit 5, and I'm going to 34 but a get 35, 34 but a bit 35, and I'm going to 34, and I'm on 5.
And then it was over, and the headlines next day told the tale. Jefferson County, Kentucky, owned an old steamboat.
We didn't save the riverfront, but we got the Avalon.
The Avalon had come within $500 of becoming a restaurant in Knoxville, the intention of the second highest bidder. Parts of the boat were auctioned separately, and her old calliope went its separate way. But amazingly, no one even wanted her brass bell or her whistle, and they remain on the boat to this day. Within a few weeks, the Avalon was towed to Louisville, and her new career began. Every year of her existence, the boat has traveled somewhere, but 1962 was unique, for it was the only year in her entire history that she did not travel under her own power.
She was in terrible condition when they towed her over to the weed lot there at River Service. The heel end of the stage was dragging in the river over the side of the boat. Everything on it was in bad shape. There were concrete patches in the hull. Anything that had any value at all was stolen or sold.
Her new career was certainly off to a shaky start. It was not a universally popular purchase, and more than a few eyebrows were raised at the seemingly frivolous use of taxpayer dollars.
It was a very controversial buy at the time, and a lot of people here in the community were up in arms. They didn't understand why the county judge would take $34,000, the taxpayers' money, and go out and buy an old boat. And as the story goes, some of the folks actually would park their car on River Road, walk over, and they'd park the weeds, and they'd park the bushes, and they'd look over and they'd see the Avalon. Well, she was in rough shape. She was a sight to see, from what I understand. And some of the folks would become fairly enraged once they saw the wreck that $34,000 bought.
A politically motivated taxpayer lawsuit was filed challenging the county's authority to buy the boat at all. The cost of the Avalon per taxpayer worked out to something like 6 cents per person. By and large, though, the public was in favor of the boat, at least those who hadn't gotten a good look at her. The city of Louisville soon joined into a cooperative arrangement with the county to manage and operate the boat. Judge Cook appointed an advisory panel of local business leaders to decide how best to use the Avalon. Former Belle of Louisville board chairman Clyde Glass.
So I called him back. I said, well, I'll take a place on that board, but I want to be the first to tell you I didn't think you should have bought it.
Someone was needed to oversee the actual repairs, and it was C.W. Stahl, a lifetime veteran of the river, who suggested Alan Bates.
He suggested to Judge Marlowe Cook that I would be a good person to send to the Belle of Louisville to start the restoration. They expected me to clean her up, get rid of some of the trash or all of it, and get her in pretty good shape.
While the administrative details were being worked out, slowly the boat herself began to come back to life. Estimates to completely repair the Avalon ran as high as $85,000. But the final cost proved considerably less as more and more volunteers came forward to donate time and materials. Almost as an afterthought, it occurred to someone that the boat should have a new name.
In New London, Connecticut, I met Nancy Rimmers from Louisville, born and raised in Louisville, lived in Audubon Park. Everybody at Connecticut College called Nancy Belle because she had a southern accent. And when it came time to name the Avalon, it wasn't very hard for me to figure out how to name it the Belle of Louisville.
On October 15th, 1962, the Belle of Louisville was officially born. By November, the legal issues had been settled, and shortly afterwards the Belle went into dry dock at Jeff Boat for the long overdue hull repairs.
That it was estimated that 80% of her hull was concrete, which is a patching. You can use concrete to patch leaks in her hull, and 80% of the hull had a concrete patch in it. So they cut the concrete out of the boat and put new plate in over at Jeff Boat. She spent the winter over there essentially, and then came back.
About January 1963, they engaged Paul Underwood as master of the boat, and Paul was an old-timer, and he'd been everywhere and done everything. It was a good choice. He hired Dave Creselius as chief engineer, and Dave got the engines and boilers in shape.
By the spring of 1963, the Belle was operable, but just barely.
I never will forget the day we were going to take it on a trial run, and that thing started up and the paddle wheel started and we pulled away from the riverfront. I was aft and Nancy Cook was forward, and I started walking forward as we were moving up under the Kennedy Bridge, and Nancy was coming back and tears were coming down her face, and I hugged her and I said, "My gosh, it works." And she said, "Thank goodness it works."
With the lawsuit settled and the Belle finally running, public opposition to the boat largely disappeared. Judge Cook had also devised a novel plan for dealing with his most outspoken critics. The boat had cost 6 cents per taxpayer, and whenever someone complained, he simply paid them off from a jar of pennies he kept in a drawer of his desk.
Some of them insisted on a check, and it's very interesting because I wrote several checks for 6 cents, but none of them were ever cashed. I think they just wanted to say they got their 6 cents and they could show everybody that they got it.
It had taken nearly a year to get the boat running again, and public interest was beginning to lag. Something spectacular was needed to attract attention again. In a city known for horse racing, what could be more natural than a good old-fashioned steamboat race? It had been more than 30 years since a highly publicized steamboat race had been run on the Ohio River. And what better opponent for the oldest working steamboat on the inland rivers than the second oldest steamboat?
Really and truly, all of the credit for the steamboat race belongs to a delightful man by the name of C.W. Stahl. C.W. knew all the people on the Delta Queen, knew Betty Blake, who was their publicity director. And it was through C.W., really and truly, that the race started, and we put out the challenge.
Tying the event into the annual Kentucky Derby festivities would ensure publicity. But at first, Derby Festival officials were less than enthusiastic.
They were not crazy about the steamboat race, and they didn't really want it part of the festival. And I really did not learn until much later that in the parlance of the old horse bettor, a fixed race is called a boat race. And consequently, the Churchill Downs people felt that the connotation of having a boat race as part of the Derby Festival week associated with the Kentucky Derby was just something they wanted no part of. Obviously, it's now a very integral part of it, but I did not know that, and I found it rather comical.
The Delta Queen herself had been struggling financially, so the publicity value alone of a race was irresistible. April 30th, 1963. While the Belle could run, she was really in no condition to race, and the outcome proved it. As the Belle still struggled upriver, the Queen reached the turnaround point and came back. Her calliope played "Goodbye, Little Girl, Goodbye" as she passed the Belle again on her way to an easy victory. For the Belle, in military terms, it was a tactical defeat, but an overwhelming strategic victory.
One of the networks that covered it by helicopter estimated that there were 250,000 people on each side of the river. We even beat the attendance at the Kentucky Derby that year. So,
A new tradition had been born, and the annual race against the Delta Queen remains one of the highlights of the year for both these grand old steamboats. Nearly half a century had passed since the Idlewild left Pittsburgh on a cold January morning. Now the Belle of Louisville officially embarked on what would become the longest phase of an already long and memorable life. Over the next few years, the Belle gradually developed the routine that she follows to this day. Early on, the boat made several publicity tramping trips up and down the river. But she soon learned what the Avalon had known some years before, that the tramp excursion business was no longer profitable. But in one of these early trips, she managed to top even the Avalon's old score by going all the way up the Green River to Lock 3 at Rochester, Kentucky. She was the largest steamboat ever to go that far, and it was one of the very few places that the Avalon had never been. Hereafter, she would stick closer to home. As years passed and funds became available, the boat underwent more changes. The dance floor was made more elegant when Alan Bates designed a new decorative ceiling. A new concession stand, gift shop, and bar were installed. The last major structural changes were made in the mid-1960s and were largely the result of the growing popularity of the annual steamboat race. The Belle's blunt, stubby bow had served her well in her ferryboat days, but cut down her speed. And if her engines could last almost indefinitely, boilers were a different matter and must be replaced periodically. So in the mid-1960s, Bates designed a new, sleeker bow, and new boilers were installed. While the bow worked well, the boilers were a disappointment. For a while it appeared that the race might be doomed. But a successful fundraising campaign was launched, and in 1968 the boilers were replaced again. The replacement boilers worked fine and are on the boat today. The Belle quickly became one of the area's most popular tourist attractions, and within a few years she was making enough money so that she only rarely needed public funds. Originally part of the Jefferson County Park System, later a separate city-county agency was formed to manage the boat.
C.W. was the first chairman. He was chairman for 7 years, and I stayed as chairman for 18 years. And our biggest job was keeping the politicians away so we could run it.
For several years, the boat operated out of Cox Park, while the new 4th Street Wharf was built. Generous public support has long been a key factor in the Belle's success.
Wendell Smock, who was a delightful, delightful gentleman in Louisville, bought us the first air calliope, just regular air, and Wendell decided that you couldn't hear it going up and down the river as far as you used to be able to, and so he found a gentleman up the Illinois River someplace who built the calliope that's on the boat now and bought it and gave it to the Belle.
In the early years, most of the officers were seasoned veterans of the river with many years' experience. Captain Paul Underwood served as the boat's master for 4 years. He was succeeded by Captain Charles Brashear, who served until his untimely death in 1975. Captain Charles J. Larkin then took over and held the post until 1983. For several years, even Doc Holly returned to the boat as alternate master. Several years earlier, he had happily returned the brass engine caps he had taken from the Avalon.
It's still my very favorite boat of all boats.
All that time, the Belle was attracting a new generation of river enthusiasts. Many first rode the Belle as school children, and returned later as teenagers looking for summer jobs. River historian and enthusiast Keith Norrington.
My parents were taking me one day to Louisville to see, of all things, the Kentucky Railway Museum, because I was interested in trains at that time. And as we crossed the 2nd Street Bridge, I looked down, and there lay the Belle of Louisville, all decked out there in flags and bunting and calliope tooting and steam and smoke billowing, and the whistle blew, and that transformed my life. From then on, it was steamboats and no more trains. I ended up working on the Belle for 6 summers while I was in high school and college.
Some who came as teenagers chose to stay on. Working on the Belle of Louisville is the only job Mike Fitzgerald has ever known.
Well, I thought it would be an interesting job. I thought it would be fun. It'd be outdoors. Not only was it something to do and was it a neat job, but it's one that I quickly fell in love with. I've loved every position I've had. I enjoyed being a deckhand, a mate, the ship's carpenter, pilot, captain. Every job I've had on this boat has been an interesting one. It's been exciting. It's been a lot of fun.
In 1983, Captain Mike Fitzgerald broke with tradition by becoming the youngest captain in the Belle's history.
When Charlie Larkin died, we appointed Mike as captain of the Belle. And that took a lot of nerve because Mike was in his 20s.
In 1985, Captain Fitzgerald launched an ambitious 11-year plan to restore the boat as far as practical to her earliest appearance.
Over the past 11 years, we've practically restored everything on the boat, top to bottom. We took pictures of the Avalon, we took pictures of the Idlewild, and we would look at those, and anywhere in the restoration process, if we could take her back some to the way she originally was, we would. In a lot of respects, especially the Texas cabin and the pilot house windows, how they slide and open now is the same way that they did back in the Idlewild days when she was first built. Now the interior of it, although we've kept it to a period of steamboat architecture, we know it's not anything the way it originally looked. It's much more elegant, as this boat was originally built pretty much as a work boat to get a specific job done. We added a touch of elegance throughout the restoration. The exterior of the boat has all new windows, all the siding's new, including the steel bulkheads on the main deck. So on the outside of the boat, from the waterline all the way up to the top of the pilot house, it's been pretty much restored. And the neat thing about the entire restoration program is that 95% of this work was done by our own crew members. The pilot house area of the boat is probably one of the most original. The pilot wheel, the steering levers, the way she handles, that's all pretty much original and has changed very little since 1914. The main engines, which were used when the boat was built, same ones. The majority of the pumps and fixtures in the engine room have been replaced. Her cap snout on the bow is original. So without a doubt, her main engines, the capstan on the bow, and the pilot house steering mechanism, the pilot wheel itself, all that is definitely original equipment.
In 1989, the Belle's place in American history was officially recognized when she was named a National Historic Landmark.
There's only 5 national landmarks within the city limits of Louisville, and we have 2 of them right here. This boat is a national landmark, as well as our wharf boat, the Mayor Andrew brought us.
Today, the Belle of Louisville remains one of the area's most popular tourist attractions and maintains a busy schedule.
Spring is the hardest season. There's a lot of nights where you get off at midnight and you're here at 7 o'clock the next morning. You've got the weather to contend with. Generally, if we're going to get high water, that's when we get it. We're in the process of getting the boat painted up, get her presentable for the season. We're running school field trips in the morning and prom trips late at night. We have the steamboat race, which there's a lot that goes into preparing the boat. And we have the Derby festivities, and we do want her to look her best. After the spring, then we get into our public season, which runs the end of May to Labor Day. That's a more routine season. You have a trip every afternoon, Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturday nights. And then we run charter trips the other nights. You get into your established maintenance routines. On certain days you scrub, on certain days you work in the wheel, certain days you paint. And the fall, the weather turns really pretty here. Then we do special trips. We'll do McAlpin Lock trips. And then we don't have public trips, so they're all charter. So the weekends are busy. And so schedules that were where we had worked, in many cases, 50 to 60 hours a week during the summertime, falls back to a 40-hour schedule for the officers and the crew. And so you get more time off. Wintertime, it varies. We've undergone major renovations where we've kept the crew, where they've done construction all winter long, or we've been in the shipyard. Other winters are much quieter.
Every 5 years, the Belle goes into dry dock for required Coast Guard inspections.
We've had metallurgists and engineers, marine engineers from Jeff Boat come down and marvel at the construction of our hull and how well it's held up.
One day each year, the attention of the entire community focuses on the river, the annual Great Steamboat Race with the Delta Queen. With only brief interruptions, the race has been held for well over 30 years. The only prizes are bragging rights and a pair of gilded antlers. And for almost as long as the race has been held, the question has been asked, is the race fixed?
I do not know this race to be fixed. The Delta Queen and the Belle Louisville are evenly matched. Now everybody says, well, the Delta Queen's much bigger and has more powerful engines. Well, she's bigger, but she's also got brass beds. She's also got galleys and freezers. She carries less passenger, but she's got more boat to push up and down the river than we do. If you compare the Belle's size and dimensions to her horsepower versus the Delta Queen's, we're actually the faster boat. So no, the race is not fixed. And also, steamboats are temperamental beings. You can do all you want. Some days they just run better than others. Actually, captains have very little to do with steamboat racing. We're just an extra 150 pounds or whatever. But they get all the credit. The press and the media think that there's only one person who works on the boat, and that's the captain. And actually, of all the people working on the boat, he's probably physically doing the least. So no, the race is not fixed.
This wasn't a canoe race, it was a steamboat race, and anything's fair as long as you win.
You just don't cheat in a steamboat race. There's no such thing. There are no rules.
So, for all intents and purposes, the race is not fixed. It just doesn't have any rules. But one thing the steamboat race does have in common with the Kentucky Derby: most of the observers are far more interested in partying than in who wins the race. So popular has the Belle become that in 1995 Jefferson County purchased a second excursion boat, the Spirit of Jefferson.
The Spirit of Jefferson was bought by Jefferson County Judge Dave Armstrong to help serve the people in the lower river, which would be just below the McAlpin Locks and Dam. It's very difficult to get a boat to travel through the locks and back, so the judge wanted to get a boat put down at the Farnsley Mormon home that could serve southwest Jefferson County. For years, they've wanted us to bring the Belle down. We have on occasion, but we're unable to do it on a regular basis due to the cost and the obstacle of locks. The Spirit of Jefferson is much more versatile, it's much faster, much more inexpensive to operate, and we're able to serve southwest Jefferson County. It's been a big hit and a super success this season. We expect it just to continue to grow in the future. Probably the most important contribution the Spirit will have to the Belle Louisville's operation is that being more inexpensive to operate, it produces a considerable amount of net income, which will be used to support the overall operation, which also means it will be used to help support the Belle of Louisville.
But as popular as the Belle is, running an old steamboat is a very expensive proposition. In the 1960s, it cost about $900 a day to operate the boat. By the 1990s, that figure had climbed to $6,000 a day. In an average year, the Belle barely breaks even. While the Belle of Louisville is not in danger, neither is she as fully appreciated as she perhaps should be.
I think in the community where the Belle has operated for so many years that in some respects it may be taken for granted because we have it here and we see it every day during the cruising season.
Nothing makes this more apparent than on the rare occasions when the Belle gets to leave town for a few days. Every 3 years, Cincinnati hosts Tall Stacks, a grand festival honoring the Queen City's proud river heritage. For a few days, the Belle gets to relive a bit of her own past as she steams up the river to Cincinnati, stopping overnight at Carrollton, Kentucky, and running an excursion just like the old days.
When we do take her out of town, every small town, every hamlet, every small settlement along the riverbank that we pass, people come out and they wave and they want us to blow the whistle and play the calliope, and it's a lot of fun.
Then on to Cincinnati, where she is greeted as an honored guest.
This boat was the most loved boat there. Everyone wanted to see this boat. It was the real thing. The Belle came in, steam rolling up around her, and the engineers would have her huffing and puffing as she came in. All these wonderful sounds and the steam blowing on the crowd, and at night the boat lit up. Just a tremendous amount of personality that this boat has. Through the steam, it just reaches out and touches you. It's hard to explain, but if you watch the magic of the boat work on the people.
Today, the Belle of Louisville is literally in better than new condition. She inspires a loyalty and affection in her crew that goes far beyond just the duties of a job. She attracts young and old, and in the end, it is the crew that keeps the boat going day to day, while keeping alive the skills of yesterday.
What I'm making here, the dog's tail, starting off with each loop, running around each other. It's like continuing. It makes the tip of the tail, closing on each other, working all the way around. This is also called a back splice. It is to hold on it, you roll it, moves down all the line from the beginning all the way to the end. And this is considered a back splice.
Hey, my name is Ann Koppel. I'm Chief Purser on the Belle of Louisville. I'm responsible for the concession stand and the souvenir stand and everything that is involved in that. Selling of tickets also. I like it because there's not a day that is the same. I'm up and down the river probably 6 to 8 times a week, and it's never the same.
And I'm here to describe these engines that we have on the Belle. They're built by James Reese and Sons out of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, the same people who manufactured and laid the keel for the steamer Idlewild. They're quite simple. They're what is referred to as a double-acting, reciprocating steam engine. And simply to describe them, they receive their steam from the throttle through the steam line right to the engine. You have 2 intake valves right here. As one intake valve lifts, it pushes the piston out to the end of the cylinder. It closes and the opposite valve opens. The exhaust valves work in sync also with them, so as one intake valve opens, the opposite exhaust valve opens, and it's double acting. These engines have about a 19-inch bore on the cylinder and about a 6.5-foot stroke on the action.
It does give me something to do. I'm semi-retired. Give me something to do during the summer. And I just come down here. I kind of like it. Come down here and work during the summer months with them. I get along with everybody. Have no problem. Everybody treats me all right. So I thought it was a good little job for me to be done, Give me a little extra money in my pocket.
This is our heaving line here. This down here is called a monkey fist. And we loop these up and we tie them to the eyes on the end of our lines. And this is what we use to throw the line out, because these lines are pretty heavy to throw, but these are real light and this weighs a lot. And it doesn't require a lot of the strength. It's more of a talent or luck. And you just spray, you don't hit anybody and throw it.
What we have here is a steering lever. It operates the steam-assisted steering, which is a large steam piston connected to the main tiller. As you move it right, the rudders move right. As you move it left, the rudders move left. It's sort of similar to the hydraulic systems they use on newer boats today, except we use steam. You can steer by hand if you want to, but it's a little difficult, harder than the steam-assisted steering.
Okay, this is what they call an engine order telegraph. This arrow right here is for the captain. What he has a similar device upstairs in the powerhouse. What he does is he'll ring it to where he wants to go. When he rings me, I have to ring him back with this lever right here to wherever he has it at. For each position, there's a certain turn on the wheel.
My name is Wayne McDowell. I work on the Belle I've been here approximately 10 years. I'm going to demonstrate the firing of the boilers. I got to blow each one out, make sure there's no built up fuel or oil in there. Next, I start my fuel pump, adjust my fuel valve, and light my burners.
When the passengers board here on the Belle of Louisville, I'm usually the first person they see, and as they leave, I'm the last person they see. And I always try to keep a positive image toward the Belle, and hope everybody has a good time and a good, safe trip. My daily routine, I go around and check the fire equipment, safety equipment, hoses, extinguishers, things like that. I also train the deckhands in line handling. I train them in firefighting techniques. And I really love my job here on the Belle, and I doubt if I'll ever go to another boat.
Well, the Belle is one of its own kind. It's a paddle wheel with rudders only in front of the wheel. And in order to steer you have to have headway going through the water to steer when you're going forward. Of course, when you back up, the wheel throws the water against the backing rudders and handles much better. And it's 35 feet in the air and only 5 feet down in the water, so that makes a sailboat out of it. When you get the wind on the side, well, then that makes it very difficult. It was the Idlewild when I was about 10 or 12 years old. Grandfather brought 2 or 3 cousins and me on here as a moonlight excursion. I thought it was the biggest, shiniest thing I ever saw in my life. This is the last one of its kind in the world. And I guess that makes it a little more fun to pilot too. You put 2 antiques together, well then you got a pair.
Someone once described it as the cacophonous mixture of all the tragedy and romance that is steamboating. And they've been used as far as the capacities of advertising for the boats. Back in the old days when the boats would tramp from town to town, such as when this boat was the Avalon, they would have the calliope turned on some miles out of town. They would order the Professor, and the Professor is the name that the person who played it, P-E-R, Fesser. The captain would order it turned on, and thus it would serve as a form of free advertising, and it would draw in all the people from the countryside and from the town. They would know the boat was coming. They would know that the excursion ride would be going on soon.
Well, I actually found out about the job because my uncle was a first mate on this boat a few years ago, and he told me about an opening, and so I came to work here. Well, as purser, it's my responsibility to oversee the souvenir stand and the concession stand and the ticket booth and make sure they have their money and all the supplies they need. I love the history of it. It's great.
I'm night chief engineer on the Belle of Louisville. I oversee the engineering department on the night shift. Responsibilities, mechanical upkeep of the boat, mechanical, electrical, plumbing, etc. I've been with the boat 23 years.
The old stories to tell us.
Not on film.
I'm a lucky man to be a part of this. I'll say what Captain James Phillips said, and he said this boat will outlast him, and I think this boat will outlast me.
She has outlasted many a crew member, and should outlast many more. For there is something about this old steamboat that grows on you, and it is difficult to spend much time on her without developing a genuine affection for her.
I think that this boat will have a lot of crew members in the future. Will always be people who are ready to help. There's something about the Belle of Louisville, there's something about this boat that it does get into your blood, and it's not just a river, it's the boat itself.
A few years back, while driving through Kentucky, I chanced to meet an old friend once again. I hardly recognized her. She's become respectable now, the country girl who made good, a real lady with a new name, the Belle of Louisville, and I'm proud of her. She floats there, sparkling in the sun, brightly painted and completely refurbished, waiting to take on a new complement of passengers from a newer time.
Standing on the riverbank at Carrollton, an old-timer watched her approach and commented quietly. Every time she leaves her wharf, she makes history. For well over 80 years, she has steamed along the rivers of America's heartland. Treated with loving care by her crew, supported by the community that owns her, she is likely to steam on well past 80 more.
Coming up the creek, make my eyes start to water and my knees get weak. That old big whistle when it starts to blow says, come on, it's time to go. Well, I want to be planted when I die, where I can see steamboats a-paddling by, 'cause all I ever wanted since 10 years old was to pick and ride an old boat. Now see that pilot at the wheel, shaving shoals on a 12-inch keel. I hope someday that he'll be me on the MISIP. I see that pilot at the wheel, shaving shoals on a 12-inch keel. I hope someday that he'll be me on the MISIP.